Welcome to episode 6 of the book of Revelation. And as we turn to this passage here in chapter 1, verses 12 to 16, we see the first visual imagery that come from John's, vision. First time he looks and sees. And so in the visual realm, we're going to have to encounter a lot of both pictures of texts from the Hebrew Bible, but also pictures from the Roman world, so we can envision what his word picture would have done to match the pictures in people's minds of the original audience, both to echo it and to challenge it, as we'll see. So let's dive right into verse 12 and see the rich, incredible detail of these 5 verses. So, then I turned, and this is, of course, right after he's been told to write and send it to the 7 churches. So I turned, and on turning. The verb for turning here, and we'll follow this in the Greek, as you can see, is epistrepsa, and it's a common verb in the New Testament for turning in the sense of converting. Literally, the English convert comes from the word, from the Latin meaning to turn with. Convert. Here, John is not changing his theology or his religion the way we usually think of conversion, but his perspective. We don't know where he was looking before, or we don't know which direction he's turning to look now. But when he turns to see, we'll see what he sees, at least according to the words he provides for us. So I turned to see whose voice it was that spoke to me, and on turning I saw 7 golden lampstands. So, a lot to pay attention to there. Gold things, lampstands, and of course the number 7. 7 golden lampstands, of course, brings up the menorah. And the oldest description of that biblically is from Exodus 25:31 and following, where the description of what is commanded to be made is placed. And this would have been, of course, for the tabernacle, in Hebrew Mishkan, not the temple in Jerusalem. But when we get to a series on Exodus, we'll explore all that. But here we see the description of the requirements that the menorah be made out of, lampstand here translating the Hebrew menorah, in incredible detail. And rabbis, ancient and modern, have struggled to understand what this looks like. In a moment, I'll show you something from the professor and Rabbi Stephen Fine, who says to his students, put aside your presuppositions and just try to draw a picture of what you see described here, and it's almost impossible to do. And yet, here's a menorah from the 1st century, you can see, and it looks familiar to us, doesn't it? So whether it looks like that, as described here in Exodus, or something else, is another question. And you'd note here from Exodus that each of these 7, what are 6 described as branches here, is that meant to be branched like a plant? Many people have thought of the menorah as like a tree of life, with 3 branches on each side, symbolically, and 1 in the middle. But might it also be a representation of the cosmos, with the center one as the sun and the others as planets and moon, the 5 known planets and the moon? We'll see that both the Jewish historian and philosopher Josephus, who wrote from Roman-controlled Judea in the 1st century, and Philo, the philosopher, Platonic Jewish philosopher, who wrote from Alexandria in Egypt, both thought of it as a cosmic symbol. So lots of possibilities as we begin to look at this text. Note the plant elements as described in Exodus, 3 cups shaped like almond blossoms with calyx and petals on one branch, and that repeated several times, the emphasis on the almond blossoms and the petals. So we'll see what that might mean. Let's look at golden things a little bit here in Revelation. Here we have a whole series of things that are golden, starting with these lampstands, just here in the beginning of the message of the churches that we'll see in a couple of sessions, and the sash described here, but also crowns, incense bowls, the censer, the altar, idols of gold, bowls of God's wrath, Babylon's adornment, Babylon's cup, and a measuring rod. So lots of golden things symbolizing both wealth and power and authority. While we're here, just to note the overview of this section, the depth of intertextual reference, I made this little table so you can see the wide range of connections between the images here and the images throughout here. I'm not going to go through all of those, but we will look closely at this one, and let's look at it right now so we can see the connections here that John is making and how he describes his vision, both in terms of Daniel 7 and in terms of Daniel 10. And you can see while I'm explaining this, the colored pairs that match across, not always identical. So we can see here clothing is as white as wool in Daniel 7:9, but here head and hair are white as wool. So carrying the image of white, or I'm sorry, white as wool and white as snow. Wool is connected to the hair in both places, but snow connected only to head and hair here and to clothing here. So there's at least two ways to look at this. One is that John is using the language that he knows to describe his vision as a way of relating it to an audience that, unlike many of us, are familiar with that imagery, much like an American describing today events in light of George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or other familiar imagery to install it within the tradition of American culture and symbolism. But another aspect of this is that this is not just a literary device or a strategy that he's thinking about of how to become more authoritative, but his experience. That what we're to understand as readers, that what he's seeing is the same as what Daniel saw, and in places the same as what Ezekiel saw. In other words, throughout the ages, the reality of God's presence on the other side of the veil is the same. It's eternal, and it can be counted on. And so it's a source of authority, whether to Ezekiel in exile or Daniel under the Seleucids, also available to John of Patmos within the Roman Empire. So lots of parallels there. In Revelation, as we can see, what's being described as one like a son of man or a human being. We'll come to that in a minute. Whereas what was described in Daniel was the ancient one, not the one who gets authority from that one, as we'd see in Daniel 7:13, but the one on the throne. Which is to say, in John's vision, the one like a son of man is positioned virtually identically to where God is. And we'll see a number of times where it describes God and the Lamb together in the midst of things in a way that might seem impossible, like they could both be wearing the same crown or in the same chair, but to highlight the equal power there. So he sees 7 golden lampstands, and as we'll see in a bit at the end of the chapter, the lampstands represent the churches. This is the piece I mentioned from Stephen Fine. This is from Torah.com, and you can see the link right here. A wonderful summary of this book, and here's the cover of the book. Professor Rabbi Fine teaches at Yeshiva University, a leading Jewish university, and this is published by Harvard University Press, his book. So a pretty authoritative source, and he provides a whole series of pictures here and issues to discuss about that. And so I want to draw your attention to a couple of them in my own imagery here. So here is the image of the menorah on the Arch of Titus. Titus being the Roman general and later emperor who conquered Judea after the Zealot and other coalition revolt in the late 60s. And so you can see he's portrayed the menorah there being taken away to highlight his victory over the temple. That menorah in Roman iconography matches what you can see here of the menorah in more Jewish iconography, both as a seal, just like the seals here, to seal a letter or something with wax, also as a ring, and also as a floor mosaic. So we can see that menorahs, these lampstands, were ubiquitous throughout that time period, as they remain today, as Professor Fine shows in his book. The lampstands, because they're supposed to represent plants and then light, are this connection between the heaven and earth, between the two sides of the veil. Even in non-apocalyptic Jewish literature, it's understood that the light is from God and goes to God, and that the menorah represents the link between heaven and earth. So very fitting that the lampstands here representing the churches are the bridge between heaven and earth. And then when he looks in the midst of the lampstands, in the midst, as you can see here, meso and Greek is used a number of times, including at the very end in Revelation. It highlights the presence of both Jesus as human one here and later as Lamb, and of God, not ruling from far away up in some distant heaven, separate from human beings and the rest of creation, but being right in the midst. So here's the presence of the Holy One surrounded by the churches, just as we see in the scenes of heavenly liturgy, the ancient one on the throne surrounded by the elders and others. So centered with the community around. So one like the Son of Man, or the human one, Hoion anthropou here in the Greek, as you can see right here. recognizable from Daniel and certainly familiar from the Hebrew Bible, but also common in the book of Enoch. And you can see here, this is in chapter 62 in the book of Enoch, the section known as the parables. They're not parables in the same way we think of parables in the Gospels, but that's what scholars have called them. And the imagery here, as you can see, of this Son of Man sitting on his throne of glory, and who had been hidden from the beginning, now being revealed, and kings and the mighty will fall down on their faces before him and worship and set their hope on that one. So this is the hope we see in First Enoch, of a glorious figure designated by God to be the one that all will come to offer glory to. It's certainly in the book of Daniel as well, and that's where that comparison here of the structures in Daniel 7 and the language in Daniel 7 and the language in Revelation 1 are important, because the one who will receive glory and dominion from the one on the throne is described as one like a human being, who replaces in Daniel 7 the imperial beasts. And we'll see the imperial beasts in Revelation starting in chapter 12 and 13, following the imagery from Daniel. So this one like a human being, for John and certainly for the author of the book of Daniel, this is making connections back to the image of God in Genesis 1, and God's designating someone who is like a human being and therefore carries the image of God, as opposed to beasts who are rapacious and violent, as the one whom God truly gives authority to. So this would have stood over against the Roman imperial claims that the emperors were designated by the gods to rule. This Son of Man or human was clothed with a long robe with a golden sash across his chest, literally across his breasts. It's only here in Revelation and only a couple of times in Luke, elsewhere in the New Testament. Notice 7 different body parts are used to describe the human one here, so to give a relatively full picture. As one can imagine, in the Roman world, as is today, is the case, but certainly was more the case, or at least maybe the case in a different way, earlier time in U.S. history, you are what you wear, which is to say that your clothing symbolizes and makes statements to whoever you see about you, whether we call that quote-unquote formal or business attire or casual. And we certainly know quote-unquote dress codes can be enforced formally in schools or in the military and things like that, but informally with what people think of you if you dress what other people think is inappropriate. In the Roman Empire, clothing signaled status, as it continues to today, with name brand clothes and fancy bling and purses and other things that say, I can afford this and you can't. In the Roman Empire, it was both about wealth and also about fabric, as it is now. Later in the Roman Empire, it was silk. But in the time of John of Patmos, it was not yet silk. It was linen and cotton, and we'll see linen a number of times. But a long robe represents something luxurious, simply because there's more. But it also represents a priestly image, and you can see that here in this image of the Emperor Augustus as a priest. It's not quite identical here. There's no sash across his chest, but you see the image of a long robe. And the idea of the emperor being portrayed as a priest is to say that the king also includes the power to mediate with the gods. And of course, Jesus is being portrayed also with royal and priestly attributes here. Otherwise, the image of an emperor, as you can see, the Emperor Domitian here, from the emperor who is reigning at the time of the Book of Revelation was written, normally would be portrayed bare-chested, as you see there, and sometimes even naked or near naked as an expression of divinity. So the human one being completely covered here with a long robe and a golden sash is very different than the image of an emperor as divine, but not that different than the idea of a priest mediating the divine to others. And then, so we've seen the clothing he wears, and now we see, again, this connection from Daniel 7, white as white wool, white as snow. Notice the hair that's being described. So when people take this, unfortunately, and either portray it as white skin and suggesting that God is white, or that the white means an old man, it could mean that, and certainly white hair would suggest something that would happen when you get old, as it does now. But there's nothing here about the human one being ancient, like the Ancient of Days in Daniel 7. So whether it's white as purity, we'll see white a number of times in Revelation. Look how many times we see white. So to make sense of the imagery of white, we'll have to build up our experience as we continue to go through it. White as wool and white as snow. Wool actually came in different varieties of white. The wealthier people could afford more carefully bleached wool, and ordinary people might have worn more natural wool, so that whiteness would be a symbol also of the wealth to be able to afford to bleach it that purely. And eyes like a flame of fire here. You see a homoios here for like. So many things that are being compared. So his eyes are not flames of fire. They're like that. And of course, that's echoing also from Daniel and other places you could see. Similarly, with the feet like burnished bronze, the Greek here, kalkolabano, nowhere else other than these two places in any Greek literature, so it's not clear exactly what it means in terms of its metallurgy, but we see Ezekiel 1:7 from the Hebrew using that same image to describe bronze feet there. And that's establishing something of strength. We might note that in some of the court stories in Daniel, the statues of the imperial kings like Nebuchadnezzar would start with solid things like gold and bronze and then become things like clay, indicating fragility over time. So bronze represents standing with a firm foundation. Refined as in a furnace, this phrase you can see here used many times in the Hebrew Bible, often about moral qualities. So purifying people as minerals are refined in a furnace. Here it's obviously not about the moral qualities, but simply, again, the wealth and care, artistic care taken to provide the best possible materials to compare the human one with. And the voice like the sound of many waters. Both many in the sense of diversity, also in the sense of loud, but note the comparison of the waters. Not like the trumpet, not like something that humans are blowing, and certainly not like something completely artificial, like, say, a drum, but a natural sound, a sound coming from the earth, like a waterfall or a mighty river. So to highlight the sound of creation that will hopefully, pun intended here, drown out the sound of empire. In his right hand, of course, the hand of power throughout the Hebrew Bible, you see right here in Revelation, and other right things, the scrolls in the right hand, an oath that comes from the right hand in chapter 10, and the mark of the beast on the right hand. He held 7 stars. And the 7 stars here do reinforce the idea that the menorah is a cosmic symbol. And Bruce Molina here, as you can see, the note from him, does his whole commentary on the book of Revelation from this cosmic perspective, that what John is doing is looking up at the sky and interpreting the constellations in terms of how they would have been understood by the Romans and the Jews of the time, and then reinterpreting them in light of his experience. So whether we think of that menorah as cosmic, as holding the stars, or as in a sense of planets as also stars within their world, which is to say bright objects in the sky, either way, the menorah matches what's in his right hand here, literally holding stars from the sky. And from his mouth, and we'll see many things come from mouths here. Here's just a list of them, as you can see. We'll see lukewarm disciples, fire, smoke, and sulfur, the negative things of, in the same way we might say in English, blowing smoke as propaganda or obfuscating the truth. Fire coming out from the mouth, fire threatened to come out from the mouth of witnesses, water from the mouth of the dragon, blasphemous words and foul spirits, and a two-edged sword here, matching the two-edged sword here. That image of the two-edged sword, as Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza notes here, identifies Christ as judge of the communities. Two-edged meaning, of course, that it cuts both ways. And it's sharp. A number of things are sharp also in Revelation. So this sense of no messing around. Things are going to be cut through, and the truth is going to be revealed, and the evil is going to be cut out and destroyed before this book is done. This is not a book of suggestions. This is a book of making decisions, human decisions and divine decisions that change the world. We already saw we're seeing this sword first here. We'll see it many more times, and especially in the seals here, when we'll see how these two different words for swords, Ramphia and Makare, have different meanings in the Roman world. But we'll save that until we get to the seals in chapter 6. And his face like the sun shining at full force. What a powerful image that is. Faces throughout the Hebrew Bible are important, and obviously when we look at faces, we see people more clearly than when we only hear their voices, and it's harder to lie and mislead people when we're face to face. So we recall texts like Exodus, where Moses is said to have talked to Yahweh face to face. Here, the human one is facing John of Patmos with a face like the sun, fully shining with full force, or literally in the power, in the full power of the sun. Probably invoking, as Gibbon suggests here, Sol Invictus, who was a powerful divinity in the reign, in the realm of Apollo. And several centuries later, was one of the chief divinities of the Emperor Constantine, who of course took Christianity as his official imperial religion. Okay, I better keep going, or this little piece is going to go longer than even I want it to. So that's what he sees, and we're gonna let it go there, because what follows is his reaction. And so if you saw something like this, how would you experience it? I'd like to encourage you, when we get beyond the words and the imagery and the intertextual echoes from Hebrew scripture or the familiar images from the Roman Empire, imagine yourself having an experience like this. Imagine just turning around and seeing something so powerful and overwhelming as a face that shone like the sun with full force. What would you do? What words would you put it in? How would you try to express that to friends and family today? Do you think they would believe you? All right, to be continued next time. See you then. Bye-bye.